Welcome to this explainer. You know, when a tragedy strikes and someone takes their own life, who is to blame? It is an incredibly heavy question, right? Well, today we're unpacking a profoundly challenging and just meticulously structured theological paper by Ryan McLean. It's titled Through My Fault: Suicide, Ecclesial Omission, and the Temporal Mission of the Church Militant. This paper asks a really stark, uncompromising question about accountability, mental health, and the actual structures of the Catholic Church. It completely challenges the way institutions traditionally respond to tragedy by shifting the focus entirely away from the victim and onto the system itself. Let's dive in.
Okay, to really grasp this, we have to start with the human stakes at the very center of the paper. The author anchors his entire theological framework in a real-world tragedy, the heartbreaking story of pageant queen Chesley Christ. Just listen to these words from a 2021 essay she wrote on turning 30. She said, "Why work so hard to capture the dreams I've been taught by society to want, when I continue to find only emptiness?" It's a devastating, deeply personal look into a profound sense of isolation, especially when you consider her incredible outward success. It forces us to confront a really tough reality. How can someone be surrounded by people, yet feel entirely alone?
The author uses her devastating words to point out this massive, chilling contrast. On one hand, you have the internal space of her despair, feeling like she's quite literally running out of time to matter. And on the other hand, you have the physical, institutional presence of the church itself. It forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Was this physical, supposedly welcoming space actually accessible to someone feeling that specific kind of cold, quiet isolation? It just totally highlights the gap between what an institution claims to be and what a suffering person actually experiences in the real world.
And then we get to this final, just heartbreaking message she sent to her mother in 2022. She wrote that she could not bear the crushing weight of persistent sadness, hopelessness, and loneliness any longer. So when someone dies this way, completely overwhelmed by hopelessness, who actually failed? McLean's paper insists that the church cannot just look outward or simply point to mental illness as the sole culprit here. It has to ask this terrifying question of itself.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the paper. It argues that every suicide should be treated as, quote, prima facie evidence requiring ecclesial examination. Okay, what does that actually mean in plain English? Basically, instead of starting with the usual theological debates about damnation or simply pointing the finger at secular society, the church needs to look inward. The church should use the tragedy as a reason to honestly examine its own failures. Did the community fail to make Christ's love genuinely accessible to that specific person before their time ran out?
To really get why the author says this, we actually have to talk about time. We live sequentially, right? Just one day at a time, and our timeline hits a hard physical boundary at death. But God's relationship to time is immediate and eternal. God isn't trapped in our linear timeline, and he certainly doesn't lose track of a person just because they cross that physical boundary of death.
To make this incredibly clear, the author includes this brilliant little section in the appendix called Angela's Explainer, using a totally child-friendly analogy. Imagine your life is a movie. You and I, we have to watch it scene by scene. We can't skip ahead, we can't pause it. But God is holding the entire reel of film. He sees the whole thing all at once. This means death is a hard boundary for us, the earthly church, because our time to physically intervene has ended, but it is absolutely not a boundary for God's knowledge or his mercy.
So, because human observers have a highly limited view of a person's complete internal struggle, like we don't see every fear, every pressure, or the exact degree of psychological freedom they had in their final moments, the paper asserts that we have absolutely no right to declare anyone definitively condemned. That judgment is left entirely to God's perfect mercy. But, and this is a huge pivot, the church must hold the living accountable for what they failed to do while the clock was still ticking.
All right, so how does the paper define the church's actual mission then? Well, it looks at Christ's own conduct. Christ didn't just stand at a pulpit, teach the truth, and wait around to see who happened to show up. His entire ministry was a refusal of abandonment. Think about it. He actively left the 99 to go into the wilderness for the one lost sheep. He offered personal recognition to Zacchaeus before demanding any sort of restitution. He restored Peter after his denial through a close, personal relationship, not expulsion. Christ modeled an active, relentless pursuit.
Think of it literally like a giant game of hide and seek. God isn't tapping his foot waiting for us to figure out how to stop hiding and come to him. As the author brilliantly notes, lost sheep don't form search parties for themselves. They're lost. The burden of the search falls squarely on the shepherd. The shepherd has the capacity and the responsibility to see that someone is missing and to actually go out and find them.
So according to this framework, Christians absolutely cannot treat difficult, messy, or isolated people as acceptable losses. Love requires actual presence. It does not hide behind a clipboard or wait for someone in the absolute depths of despair to navigate a complex bureaucracy. Christ didn't run his ministry like a customer service desk requiring an appointment for mercy, right? True love means stepping out from behind the desk and meeting the person in their pain.
Now, you might be thinking, this is just a nice, poetic, theological metaphor. Nope. The author points out that this is codified directly into Catholic canon law. It is a binding legal obligation that applies to every single baptized member of the Church. The mission to actively ensure that the message of salvation reaches all people, it isn't optional. It's a universal mission, meaning the obligation is strictly legal and it encompasses everyone.
What's really fascinating here is the massive emphasis on everyday people, the laity. Why? Because you inhabit the spaces that a priest or a bishop simply cannot reach. You're in the homes, the public schools, the corporate workplaces, the hospitals, the suburban neighborhoods. In many moments of extreme human crisis, the nearest representation of the church isn't a priest standing at an altar, it's a coworker, a classmate, or a neighbor. You are literally the front line.
The author uses another amazing analogy here to explain the concept of truly reaching someone. If you write out a beautiful birthday invitation for a friend, but you leave it sitting in your sock drawer, the invitation exists, right? It's perfectly crafted. But if it never leaves the drawer, it never actually reached your friend. In the exact same way, the most beautiful, theoretically perfect church program is utterly useless if it doesn't cross the threshold into a lonely person's actual life.
Now, you might ask, if everyone is responsible, doesn't that just mean nobody is? Not exactly. Think of it like a school play. A school play only works if the principal, the drama teacher, the lead actors, and the stage crew all do their specific individual jobs. If the play fails, you don't just blame the abstract concept of the school. You figure out exactly who dropped the ball on their specific assignment.
So the paper lays it out like this. The church is not just some abstract, faceless blob where accountability can magically disappear. It's a highly structured chain of command with very specific, layered duties, from the pope at the top, down to the local bishop, the parish pastor, and right down to the laity. Everyone is on the exact same mission, but everyone has a drastically different assignment based on their specific office and their physical proximity to the person in pain.
Let's look specifically at the bishops. Canon law dictates that a bishop's responsibility is tied to a geographic territory, which is fascinating. That means they aren't just responsible for the practicing Catholics sitting neatly in the pews on Sunday. They are legally accountable for the spiritual care of the isolated, the non-practicing, Christians of other denominations, and even unbaptized within those borders. An institution cannot just count its active members and call it a success if the isolated people within their city limits are quietly slipping through the cracks.
And this highlights a massive dissonance the author points out: administrative availability versus evangelical accessibility. Having a helpline on a website or keeping office hours, that is administrative availability. It passively waits for the broken person to reach out. But actively becoming a genuinely safe, proactive, and reachable presence in someone's life, especially someone who is too crushed by hopelessness to even make a phone call, that is evangelical accessibility. And the paper argues the church is called exclusively to the latter.
So bringing it all together, the author uses the ancient grammar of the Catholic penitential prayer, the Confiteor, where believers literally strike their breast and say, "Through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault." The author uses this incredibly powerful imagery to shift the focus completely away from institutional blame, or worse, blaming the victim. It forces the individual to stop looking for a scapegoat and ask the terrifying question, what did I fail to do?
We're going to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative question directly from the author's framework. When tragedy strikes, we must deeply reflect. Within my own relationships and authority, did I make Christ's refusal of abandonment easier or harder for this person to receive? It's a daunting standard for sure, but as we've seen today, it's rooted in the very core of the institution's mission. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this challenging paper. I'll see you next time on The Explainer.